What are you up to right now? Winding down from a long day, maybe on a late-night drive, or just looking for something to listen to before you drift off. If you're in the mood for a story, a real story, then get comfortable. You're in the right place. Power isn't about having the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the one person who doesn't have to raise it. It's a quiet gravity, a force that bends the world without a single command. But what the world doesn't see is the immense crushing weight of that gravity. This is the story of Julian Hayes, a man who reminded an entire industry of that fact. From a seat he wasn't even supposed to be in. The week had been brutal. San Francisco, a city built on dreams and disruption, had a way of draining you even when you were the one doing the disrupting. For Julian Hayes, founder and CEO of the tech behemoth Nexus Dynamics, the last 72 hours had been a marathon of glass-walled boardrooms and lukewarm coffee. He had smiled, he had pitched, he had reassured investors that their 9-figure checks were safe with him, all while navigating the invisible currents that were part of his daily reality. He was a ghost in his own machine. At the valet stand of a 5-star hotel, a young man had tossed him the keys to a Lamborghini, saying, "Be quick about it, the owner's in a hurry." Julian had simply smiled, handed the keys back, and pointed to his own waiting town car. In the boardroom, a silver-haired venture capitalist had listened to his entire presentation on Nexus's revolutionary logistics AI, then turned to Julian's white CFO and said, "Brilliant plan, Tom. You've really got a handle on this. These weren't attacks. They were worse. They were microaggressions, tiny paper cuts that over time could make a man bleed out." Just yesterday, during the final investor meeting, a tense negotiation over a new round of funding, a board member had interrupted him mid-sentence. "Son," the man had started, a patronizing smile on his face. "Let's be realistic about these projections." Julian paused. The air in the room grew thick. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply held the man's gaze, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the man himself cleared his throat and mumbled, "Please continue." He had won the point, secured the funding, but the victory felt hollow. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a perpetual defendant, constantly on trial. His success always subject to an invisible asterisk. It was a phenomenon that even the most accomplished leaders in the world had spoken of, that quiet, nagging feeling of being an imposter in a world that wasn't built for you. It was the weight of the crown. And right now, Julian was tired of wearing it. That's why he was here, standing in the bustling terminal of SFO Anonymous in a simple grey sweater and jeans. No private jet. No town car. Just a commercial ticket on Apex Air Flight 782 to Chicago. He didn't want to be a CEO for the next 5 hours. He didn't want to be a symbol or a trailblazer. He just wanted to be a passenger. A man in a seat with a book and a moment of peace. The cause was a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. The effect was this simple desire for anonymity. He was trading his throne for a window seat, hoping that for just a little while he could forget the burden that came with it. Because what he knew, and what the world would soon learn, is that true power isn't just about what you can command. It's about the emotional price you pay for the privilege. It's a hidden burden, a constant, quiet struggle. And as he walked down the jet bridge toward the promise of a few hours of normalcy, he had no idea that his quiet struggle was about to become very, very loud. He was looking for peace, but he was walking straight into a war, one that would be fought not in a boardroom, but in the narrow aisle of an airplane right in front of seat 3B. He found his row. Seat 3A, the aisle was empty. But in 3B, his window seat, a woman was already comfortably settled, a cashmere shawl draped over her shoulders. She had the kind of polished old-money elegance that announced itself without a single word. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed. Her fingers, adorned with a formidable diamond, were scrolling through a tablet. This was Eleanor Vance, a titan of the Chicago real estate world, a woman accustomed to the world reshaping itself to her will. Julian paused, holding his boarding pass. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and even. "I believe you're in my seat." Eleanor Vance didn't look up. Not at first. A full 10 seconds passed, a deliberate pause designed to establish hierarchy. When she finally did, her eyes, the color of a winter sky, performed a swift dismissive scan. They took in his simple gray sweater, his jeans, his travel-worn sneakers. They saw a man, not an equal. "Oh," she finally said, the single syllable, carrying a universe of condescension. "I'm sure we can sort this out, dear." She offered a thin, bloodless smile. "The lighting is much better for my work on this side of the aisle. I'm sure you wouldn't mind taking the seat across. It's practically the same. Let's stop here for a moment and dissect that. This is the subtle language of power. The word dear, a term of endearment weaponized to create distance, to infantilize. The casual wave of her hand towards the other seat, as if rearranging furniture, not people. This wasn't just a mistake over a seat. It was a quiet, brutal act of dismissal. It was a declaration that his ticket, his right to be there, was secondary to her comfort. Arrogance like this is almost always a mask, a fragile shield for a deep-seated insecurity, and it has one fatal flaw. It blinds you to the reality of who you're dealing with. Julian could have escalated. He could have flashed the platinum card in his wallet or dropped the name of his company. But he didn't. He simply stood there, patient, a calm island in the stream of boarding passengers. "My ticket is for 3B, he repeated, his voice still level. "I'd prefer to take the seat I paid for." This was the fundamental miscalculation Eleanor Vance was making. It's a mistake people make every day. They assume status is always visible, that power always wears a suit and tie. They fail to imagine that the quiet man in the simple sweater could be anything other than what their prejudice tells them he is. Prejudice at its core is a failure of imagination. Eleanor sighed, a theatrical display of inconvenience. "Look," she began, her tone hardening. "I am a platinum elite member with this airline. I've been flying this route for 20 years. I'm sure if you just speak to the flight attendant, they can find you something more suitable." The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous, a place more suitable for you. But something else was happening. 2 rows back, a college student named Maya, heading home for the weekend, had seen the whole exchange. She felt that familiar knot of frustration in her stomach. Instead of just watching, she quietly lifted her phone. She didn't hit record. She hit go live. She didn't focus on the entitled woman. She framed the shot on the calm, dignified man who was refusing to be erased. The caption was simple: "Just trying to get home. Watch this man stand his ground." The first viewer popped in. Then 10. Then 100. A quiet digital storm was beginning to gather, unnoticed by the key players in our drama. A silent witness had just given this private injustice a global audience. Eleanor Vance, secure in her bubble of privilege, had just usurped a throne, completely unaware that the man she was dismissing was not just another subject. He was the king of a kingdom she couldn't even fathom. And the crew, now approaching with practiced, placating smiles, were about to make the fatal error of bowing to the wrong monarch. They were coming to serve a customer, but they were about to be judged by an owner. And so the system arrived. It came in the form of a senior flight attendant named Mark. He had kind eyes, a weary but professional smile, and 2 decades of experience serving coffee and calming nerves at 30,000 feet. He approached the situation not as a matter of right and wrong, but as a problem to be solved, an obstacle, preventing an on-time departure. His job wasn't to dispense justice. It was to maintain order. He saw the scene through the cold, hard lens of corporate calculus. On one side, Eleanor Vance, a name that flashed Platinum Elite in the airline's database, a designation that meant hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue, a history of loyalty, a high-value asset. On the other side, Julian Hayes, an unknown face in a simple sweater, a standard first-class ticket, a variable. The corporate training drilled into him over thousands of flights kicked in. Instantly, de-escalate, diffuse, and above all, do not upset the Platinum member. "Sir, madam, is there a problem here?" Mark asked, his voice a smooth, practiced balm. Eleanor seized the opening. "This gentleman seems to be confused about his seat," she said, her voice laced with the implication that Julian was perhaps lost or didn't belong. "I've already explained that I need the window for my work. He seems unwilling to be reasonable." Mark looked at Julian, his kind eyes now holding a hint of professional impatience. He glanced at Julian's boarding pass, then back at Eleanor. He was caught, but the system he served had already made the choice for him. "Sir," he said to Julian, turning his body slightly away from Eleanor, in a gesture of confidentiality that was actually an act of alignment. "I see that this is your seat. However, in the interest of getting everyone settled and departing on time, would you be willing to accept seat 4C? It's also a window seat. I can even offer you a complimentary drink voucher for your trouble." This is the moment where indifference becomes an accomplice. Mark wasn't a racist. He was probably a good man who just wanted to get home to his family. But his actions were a perfect example of a broken system. The corporate mantra of "the customer is always right" has a dark, unwritten corollary, especially if they're a rich customer. This culture, which quantifies human worth through loyalty, tiers and revenue streams, creates an environment where basic decency becomes a negotiable commodity. It's a phenomenon we've seen play out in the real world. Time and time again, think of the infamous incident where a doctor was dragged off a United flight. The crew members weren't evil. They were following a protocol that had lost all connection to common sense and human dignity. Indifference in the face of injustice is never neutrality. It is a choice. It is siding with the oppressor. Julian looked at Mark, and for the first time a flicker of something other than patience crossed his face. It was a deep, profound disappointment. He wasn't just being dismissed by one arrogant woman anymore. He was being dismissed by the entire airline she represented. The system was telling him officially that he was less valuable, less important. "The voucher won't be necessary," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I won't be moving. I'll be taking the seat my ticket designates." He held Mark's gaze. "I suggest you honor that." The stalemate was now absolute. The polite smiles had vanished. Mark, flustered and out of options, did what all employees do when faced with a problem beyond their pay grade. He escalated. "I'm going to have to call the captain," he said, his tone now clipped and official. The gears of the machine were grinding. The situation was escalating from a simple dispute to an official incident. And the final, most powerful representative of the system on that aircraft was about to walk out of the cockpit, not to solve a problem, but to unknowingly stand trial before the one man who could sign his paycheck. The captain emerged from the cockpit, a man with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority that came from being responsible for hundreds of lives every day. He was the final word, the ultimate representative of the system on this aircraft. He listened with a practiced patience as Mark, the flight attendant, quickly summarized the situation, framing it as a simple passenger dispute with a non-compliant individual. The captain's eyes fell on Julian. It was the same look Julian had seen 1,000 times before. A look of appraisal, of measurement, of a swift and unconscious calculation that ended in a deficit. He didn't see a CEO. He saw a problem. "Sir," the captain said, his voice firm, leaving no room for negotiation. "I am the captain of this aircraft. My primary responsibility is the safety and comfort of all my passengers. This flight is already delayed. I am asking you one last time to please take the empty seat across the aisle so we can proceed with departure." Julian looked past the captain, his gaze landing on Eleanor Vance, who was now watching with a smug, victorious smile. He looked at Mark, who stood with his arms crossed, relieved that the burden of decision was no longer his. He saw the faces of the other passengers, some annoyed at the delay, others watching with a quiet, knowing sympathy. And then the captain delivered the final blow. "If you are unable to comply," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious register, "I will have to conclude that you are a disruptive passenger, and we will have you removed from the flight." That was it. The final paper cut. He wasn't a customer with a legitimate issue. He was a threat. And in that moment, something shifted inside Julian Hayes. The exhaustion, the frustration, the deep, weary anger, it all coalesced not into a fiery rage, but into a point of absolute cold clarity. He wasn't just thinking about Seat 3B anymore. He was thinking about the thousands of employees at Nexus Dynamics, many of whom were people of color, who had to navigate a world full of these moments every single day, but without his resources, without his safety net. He thought of every person who had ever been made to feel small, who had been told they didn't belong, who had been forced to swallow their dignity just to get through the day. This was no longer a personal insult. It was a systemic failure. And he, Julian Hayes, was in a unique, powerful, and unexpected position to address it. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about responsibility. The most powerful moves are made quietly. Julian simply nodded. "I understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He reached into his pocket, but it wasn't for his ID, it was for his phone. He scrolled to a single contact, his chief of operations, and typed a short, simple text message. He didn't need to make a call. The infrastructure he had built ran on quiet digital commands. "Initiate a Code Sierra on Apex Air. Full operational audit. I'm invoking the majority shareholder clause. Ground Flight 782. Now." Across the country, in the 24/7 Nexus Dynamics Command Center, an alert flashed red on a massive screen. An algorithm authenticated the command. Within seconds, a series of secure directives were automatically dispatched to the highest levels of Apex Air's parent corporation. Back on the plane, nothing happened for about 30 seconds. Eleanor Vance smirked, assuming he was calling for a lawyer. The captain stood impatient, ready to call security. And then the intercom crackled to life. But it wasn't the captain's voice. It was the first officer, his tone laced with utter confusion and a hint of panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice stammered, "this is the first officer. We have just received a non-negotiable direct executive order from the majority stakeholder of our parent company. I don't understand the reason, but our directive is to return to the gate immediately. All flight operations are to be grounded pending a full audit." A wave of confused murmurs swept through the cabin. The captain's face went pale, his air of authority vanishing in an instant. Eleanor Vance's smug smile froze, then collapsed. And on Maya's live stream, the view count exploded past 1 million. The camera panned from the shocked face of Eleanor to the bewildered crew, and finally settled on the man in the grey sweater. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a threat. He was just standing there, calm and resolute, a silent storm at the center of the world he had just turned upside down. He hadn't just gotten his seat back. He had just taken control of the entire airline. And the real turbulence was only just beginning. The plane moved, but not forward. It began a slow, surreal taxi back toward the terminal, a metal behemoth reversing its course against all logic. Inside, a stunned silence had replaced the chaos. The authority of the captain had evaporated. Eleanor Vance was frozen. The color drained from her face as the reality of her miscalculation began to dawn. And Julian Hayes, the man at the center of it all, simply took a seat, the empty aisle seat 4C, and opened his laptop. His work wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. Because while he had won the battle for seat 3B, he was now entering a war against the very system he had just seized control of. The enemy was no longer a single entitled passenger or a few compliant crew members. It was the faceless, profit-driven corporate machine itself. An urgent, encrypted video call request flashed on his screen. The board of directors for Apex Air's parent company. He accepted. A grid of grim-faced, powerful people appeared their luxurious home offices, a stark contrast to the cramped airplane cabin. This was the real power. The people who lived and died by the rhythm of the stock market ticker. "Julian, what in God's name is going on?" "A man named Marcus Thorne," the lead director demanded. His voice was a low growl. "We have a plane, a multi-million-dollar asset turning around on a runway. The FAA is screaming. Our stock is about to take a nosedive. We are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars a minute. What is happening?" They didn't see a person who had been wronged. They saw a disruption to their balance sheet. The chief financial officer jumped in his face, pale with anxiety. "Julian, the market analysts are already picking this up. Unscheduled operational event. This could wipe out our entire quarterly gains if we don't contain it. We need a statement. Now." The head of legal, a sharp woman in a severe black blazer, added her voice. "From a liability standpoint, this is a nightmare. Grounding a flight over a passenger dispute. We're exposed. The best course of action is to settle with you, of course. Name your price. We'll terminate the crew, issue a public apology, and make this go away." They offered him everything he could have wanted. A personal victory. A quiet settlement. The heads of those who had wronged him. They wanted him to take the easy way out. And this is where leadership is truly defined. Not in the moments of easy success, but in the moments of costly conviction. It's easy to do the right thing when it costs you nothing. But true leadership is about defending your values, precisely when it is most expensive to do so. Julian leaned into the camera. The quiet hum of the jet engines was his background music. "There will be no settlement," he said, his voice calm but forged from steel. "And you will not be terminating the crew. Not yet." The board stared back, stunned into silence. "You're looking at this as a line item on a balance sheet?" Marcus Julian continued, "a PR problem to be managed." "You are mistaken. This is not a financial problem. This is a cultural disease. What happened to me today was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a sickness that has infected this entire company. A culture that teaches its employees to value a platinum card more than a person's dignity." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You want to talk about cost? Let's talk about the real cost. The cost of a brand that rots from the inside out because it has no soul. The cost of losing customers who no longer believe you stand for anything. This isn't about my hurt feelings. This is about the fundamental balance of our company's soul." He held their gaze one by one through the cold distance of the screen. "So no. We will not be handling this quietly. We are going to handle this publicly. We are going to turn this airplane into a classroom. And we are going to make this moment the start of a complete and total transformation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a plane to deboard." He ended the call. He left the board of directors in their silent, luxurious offices speechless. He had just turned down a king's ransom and instead declared a moral crusade. He had refused to be a victim they could pay off. He had chosen to be a leader they would have to follow. And as the plane finally docked with the gate, the door hissing open to a world now watching everyone, the crew, the passengers, the board, and the millions watching online, was holding their breath, waiting to see what the unraveling of the old world and the building of a new one would look like. The jet bridge connected to the plane with a dull thud, and the hiss of the opening door sounded like a collective exhale. But this was not the end of a flight. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The immediate aftermath unfolded not in one single event, but in a series of cascading consequences, a web of cause and effect that rippled far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Every action has a consequence, and in the digital age that consequence arrives faster and hits harder than ever before. First, there was Eleanor Vance. She was not led away in handcuffs. Her departure was quiet, almost clinical. Two discreet airline representatives met her at the door and escorted her away from the waiting cameras. But her true punishment wouldn't be delivered by airport security. It would be delivered by the world she had built for herself. 24 hours later, a news alert flashed across phone screens. Hartwell Properties board calls, emergency session amidst viral Apex Air incident video. The brand she had meticulously crafted, built on an image of untouchable prestige, was now inextricably linked to a viral moment of public disgrace. Her clients, the very people whose approval she craved, began to distance themselves. Her world didn't just crack. It began to systematically unravel, undone by a single act of casual cruelty. Then there was the crew. Mark and the captain were not fired. That would have been too easy a simple solution to a complex problem. Instead, they were placed on indefinite paid leave. Their consequence was not termination, but education. They were required to attend an intensive empathy and corporate responsibility program. A program designed by Nexus Dynamics, one that Julian himself would later address. The story shifted from one of simple punishment to a more difficult, more meaningful narrative of change. Could they unlearn the biases the system had taught them? The question was left open, a challenge rather than a conclusion. And then there was the live stream. Maya's phone had become the epicenter of a global earthquake. By the time Julian stepped off the plane, her video had surpassed 10 million views. It was the #1 trending topic worldwide. News outlets from CNN to the BBC were running the story not just as an airline dispute, but as a powerful case study in modern-day racism and corporate accountability. In this story, there was another quieter hero. Maya, the student who chose not to be a bystander. She didn't shout or intervene. She simply bore witness. In a world that so often encourages us to look away, her simple act of hitting Go Live was an act of profound courage. She proved that you don't need to have a CEO's power to make a difference. Sometimes you just need a clear view and the will to show the world what you see. The unraveling was swift, and it was total. It showed that in our interconnected world, there is no such thing as a private act of injustice. Everyone is accountable. The old structures of power which relied on closed doors and quiet settlements were being dismantled by the radical transparency of the digital age. Julian Hayes watched all of this unfold, not with a sense of triumph, but with a heavy sense of purpose. He had exposed the sickness. He had broken the machine. Now the hardest part began, building something better in its place. The world was watching not to see if he could win a fight, but to see if he could lead a revolution. 1 year later, real change is not a single explosive event. It's a slow, grinding, relentless process. It's a series of difficult conversations, of resistant board members, of logistical nightmares, and technological hurdles. But Julian Hayes was a builder. He had built $1 billion company from nothing. And now he was rebuilding an industry's soul. He didn't just change the rules at Apex Air. He changed the game. Using the full force of his tech company, Nexus Dynamics, He spearheaded the creation of something revolutionary, the Dignity Protocol. It was a suite of tools, an AI-driven bias detection system for HR, an anonymous real-time incident reporting app for employees and customers, and immersive empathy training modules. It was a technological solution to a deeply human problem. Apex Air was the first to implement it, and the results were transformative. Customer complaints related to discrimination plummeted. Employee morale soared. And then something unexpected happened. Other airlines, seeing Apex's success, began to inquire, then trucking companies, then hotel chains, then even police departments. The protocol was becoming a new industry standard, a gold standard for corporate responsibility. The ripple effect of that one moment on Flight 782 was creating a tidal wave of change. But the final scene of our story doesn't take place in a boardroom or on a stage. It takes place on a Tuesday evening in the fluorescent-lit gymnasium of a community center in the same West Chicago neighborhood where Julian grew up. He's not wearing a suit. He's in a simple hoodie, sitting on a folding chair, surrounded by a dozen young, hungry, and hopeful black and brown entrepreneurs. He's mentoring them, listening to their dreams and their fears. A young woman, her voice full of doubt, asks him, "How do you do it? How do you deal with the investors, the clients, the world not taking you seriously, always having to prove you belong in the room?" Julian leans forward and his voice is quiet, but it fills the entire gym. "You don't," he says. "You stop trying to prove you belong in their room. You start building your own." He looks at each of them, his gaze locking with theirs. They will underestimate you. They will challenge your right to be there. Let them. Their validation is a prison. Don't seek it. Your success is not defined by their approval, but by the legacy you build in spite of their doubts. Power is not a shield to protect you from the world's disrespect. It is a tool. A tool you are given to build a world where respect is a given. He stands up and a hopeful energy fills the room. "So look down at your hands," he tells them, his voice resonating with the force of a man who has been tested by fire. "What tool have you been given? And what will you build with it?" That question isn't just for them. It's for you. What tool do you have in your hands? Your voice, your platform, your vote, your kindness, your courage. The story of Julian Hayes is a reminder that the world can be changed by one person who refuses to accept things as they are. If this story moved you, if it sparked something in you, then help us share it. Hit that like button to tell the world that stories of dignity and justice matter. Subscribe to this channel and join a community of people who believe in the power of a single story to inspire millions. And in the comments below, tell us about a time you used your own power, big or small, to stand up for what was right. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Because the revolution that started on Flight 782 doesn't have to end here. It can continue with you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.